Hello guys, gals, and those in between. We are back with the final entry in the Parasite Eve series. It's the often maligned and disregarded third entry, a game that isn't even called Parasite Eve, but rather simply The Third Birthday. Often seen as the thing that killed Parasite Eve, and designated by fans of the series as a terrible game. Well, let's see. Is it like part 2 in that it's simply misunderstood and has a few flaws? Or is it as bad as everyone says? So sit back, relax, grab a frosty beverage, and we'll dive, or rather, overdive, into The Third Birthday. Now, in between Parasite Eve 2 and The Third Birthday, there was an entire decade that transpired between said games, and the IP was just kinda collecting dust. According to Yoshinori Kitase, the idea of bringing back Parasite Eve was brought up over the years numerous times, though I haven't been able to find anything, even some concept art. So it's more than likely these revivals were nothing more than concepts set in a boardroom or by someone at Square that never got past any sort of pre-production or concept phase. It's also entirely possible that some art does exist, but it's in a shed somewhere at Square Enix Studios. The reason The Third Birthday came about was because it was the idea of one man, and this was good and bad in many ways. That man was this channel's favorite running gag, Tetsuya Nomura himself. From all the research I did, Nomura seemed to be the main person behind the revival of this game. There were other major players that had their roles, but by all accounts, Nomura was the one who really wanted to bring it back and was the driving force behind this resurrection. So, Square decided in 2007 the game would return as a mobile phone title. Yeah, Square did quite a few of these, and well, every company did. Maybe it's an East versus West thing, but if you're a fan of a Japanese property, there's a good chance they did some kind of phone game title that's now forever lost in time. While the phone news was disappointing, I can see why Nomura was so passionate about bringing Parasite Eve back. After all, he was the one who first designed Aya Brea, being asked by Sakaguchi to bring this character to life. Even the sequel, when the original artist left, Nomura was once more called on to complete Aya. So I could imagine having been asked by a head honcho at the time was a pretty big deal, and it's something that's probably important to him. In interviews, he said his reason for bringing Parasite Eve back was that it hadn't been touched in a full decade. That gap of time was actually why the game was called The Third Birthday and not simply Parasite Eve 3. Yeah, there's a bit of a rumor that's gone around that this game was never intended to be a Parasite Eve game, but that they simply slapped on the name Parasite Eve The Third Birthday to try to sell it. This is completely false. It's been stated in interviews the reason why this was called The Third Birthday was because it had been 10 years since the last Parasite Eve game, and they wanted this game to also be a starting point for any new players that came around. So yeah, similar to the idea that Silent Hill 4: The Room was never a true Silent Hill game, The Third Birthday was always intended to be a Parasite Eve game. During development of the game, Nomura spoke about how new IPs are always important, but that Square has a vast catalog of old IPs that are just gathering dust, and if they don't actually use them, people will forget about them. And he just saw this as a waste, and he's completely right. As a fan of Square and even Sega, there are so many titles that are relegated solely to whenever Sega just pumps out another classics collection like Vector Man, or for them to show up in Yakuza games. These older IPs still have value, and we can see in other hands them doing well. The best example of this is Xenogears. Square owns the rights to Xenogears, but in the time since then, not only did Xenosaga from a different company come out, but the much more successful Xenoblade Chronicles was released by Nintendo. They liked it so much they actually purchased Monolith Soft, so now that's a Nintendo property. So if Square even tries releasing a Xenogears 2, which it's never happening, it would just lead to market confusion. They basically handed Nintendo a massive franchise. And we see here what could have been if Square had continued to support that series. I'm not saying dump all the money into these games, but do something with them. or at least make them playable on newer systems. Square actually tried this. I went over this in my Sedna video, that Square had a program where they were essentially lend out their unused IPs, and seeing that all that came out of it was Fear Effect Sedna, a game universally disliked, it was clear the program didn't do that great, because we've seen nothing else. So, maybe it just needed to be a bit retooled. So Nomura, knowing Square would do literally nothing, and being correct, even 10 years later, Square is saying, hey, maybe we should focus on other titles, singles and double A's, and we have seen some of that. Remasters of older titles, though not Parasite Eve, new releases like Saga Emerald Beyond, and even remakes of older properties like Romancing Saga 2. I'm a big fan of the Saga series, but also, let's be honest, it's not a AAA title like Final Fantasy. So in today's day and age, Square would probably move forward, but back then it took someone high up on the ladder to get the gears going. So Nomura went and basically said, yeah, I want to do this. And he had the clout. In those 10 years, he made a little game, I'm not sure if you've heard of it, it's called Kingdom Hearts. After creating a franchise Square will milk for Cold Hard Gil, Nomura had the sway to take on a passion project, except he didn't really have the time. See, when the third birthday was announced, Nomura was busy directing 3 separate Kingdom Hearts games. Yes, while wanting to do a passion project of his, Nomura himself was directing Kingdom Hearts Coded, Kingdom Hearts 358 Days Over 2, I swear to Christ that is the actual way to pronounce it and it's so stupid, I love it, along with Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep. And that's just the game he was directing at the time. Yeah, the man had more on his plate, including working on Final Fantasy XIII, Dissidia, Lords of Arcana, and Final Fantasy Type O. And man, Jesus, this will be a running thread of everyone doing multiple projects at once at Square. So since he was already directing a million other games, Nomura elected to instead take on a creative producer role and to also design Aya once more, which was for the best. No offense to Nomura, I make a lot of jokes, but I actually really do enjoy Kingdom Hearts. I recall getting the second for my birthday and just playing it from sun up till sundown till I beat it. And now that I'm more financially secure, I have gone back to the games I miss and I am still enjoying Kingdom Hearts. However, that being said, Parasite Eve is such a different series in terms of character and realism, I'm not sure Nomura could go ahead and pull off a body horror story that incorporates complex themes like identity and free will. So, knowing he was too busy, Nomura actually just gave the job to Hajime Tabata, saying that he had worked with him on a previous project and they got along well. That previous project was Crisis Core. Suddenly, things were looking up. Crisis Core is considered by many to be one of the best games on the PSP, so getting the director of the game seemed in hindsight a stellar idea, especially since right around this time Square abandoned the whole phone idea and elected to have the third birthday as a PSP title. Tabata himself though was also pulling multiple games at once, co-directing Kingdom Hearts Coded, another episodic phone title, and also working on Final Fantasy Type O, which yeah, the whole 13 saga deserves a deep dive. Tabata himself said that doing so many projects was difficult. I guess unlike Nomura, whose blood must be made of pure monster energy, Tabata is just one of us, a mere mortal. He even remarked Type O was almost just completely cancelled by Square. He's on record with Square telling him to focus more on the third birthday instead of Type O, which is insane to think about. I know Type O is just a spin-off and not a mainline Final Fantasy title, but that's their big moneymaker. That was supposed to be part of their big project, with a series of loosely tied in games with a common theme and mythos known as Fabula Nova Crystallis. It was envisioned as this massive multi-game project along with the flagship 13 and 13 Versus, a follow-up to the much beloved Ivalice Alliance. So it was a shock to learn Square was like, hey, it doesn't really matter if Type O comes out, you work on the third birthday. So he did. He left Type O for a year to finish the third birthday, the game that Square was betting on. And in another dose of irony, so large it will cause any theater graduates to peak, one of those games eventually got an HD remaster and is looked at as a pretty good game. Guess which one it isn't. The last major players were Yoko, who was back doing the music, only kinda. She was also doing a lot of other projects, so she requested 2 more artists to help assist her. There's also Yoshinori Kitase, who was producing the game along with Dissidia and Final Fantasy XIII, and the director of Final Fantasy XIII, Motomo Toriyama, who was also doing 10 other things at the same time. With so many people associated with Final Fantasy XIII, it's no wonder that in Dissidia, you can actually unlock Aya as an alternate costume for Lightning, and a Lightning costume is in the third birthday. What all these people had in common besides being worked to the bone was in various interviews talked about how much they wanted the third birthday to not only succeed, but to be a success, and to continue the series. It's surreal to see how much love they had for this series, and I can only guess that it's because they wanted to return it to its roots. We're bringing it back, but Parasite Eve was also called a new type of game, a cinematic RPG that did its best to emulate a big budget Hollywood film while still being a video game. And it was the start of Square's partnership with EA, a partnership that greatly benefited Square and I would argue was instrumental in its rise in the West and its transformation into a global powerhouse. So much so it allowed them to even purchase their one-time rival Enix. I would also argue that Parasite Eve not only influenced modern-day RPGs, but just games as a whole when it comes to storytelling. So I could see the love it has, that such a consequential game was basically laid to the wayside. So with such a dedicated team, it's so odd this wasn't a hit. But I feel a good portion of the reasoning why was because just the insane schedules I've listed. Hearing stories from some game companies of crunch or basically having to sleep in your office rarely makes for an amazing experience. But with everyone set in stone, it was time to actually go ahead and create the game. Even though it was no longer a phone title, Nomura stated he still wanted each chapter to have an episodic feel to it, which I can respect. Not only because of its origins, but it also seemed they wanted each chapter of the game to go ahead and mean something, as opposed to you complete a chapter and all that really happened is you fought a bunch of enemies and changed the coffee filter in the break room, which needed to happen, but could have done more. So after every successful mission, there is something that moves the story along, for better or worse, but we'll get to that. Another decision was to make the game as an action-style shooter, and Square had some experience with this in Dirge of Cerberus. Kitase, who was producing, also produced Dirge of Cerberus, and Nomura was a character designer on it, so it made sense. But besides them both being busy, Kitase himself remarked on Cerberus' difficult development time, so it only made sense for them to seek outside talent. Also, as someone who had purchased Dirge of Cerberus and recently replayed it, this was for the best. Dirge of Cerberus is really okay at best, it gets kind of repetitive very fast, it's also short and for me wears out its welcome. I have a lot of issues with the game besides Gact. Seriously, I mostly remember Gact as a selling point. My main issues are, I just feel like Final Fantasy VII never needed this wide, expansive story that stretches into the past and future, and insanity like supposedly linking 7 and 10. Honestly, it's all pretty moot because with the sheer insanity that is the Final Fantasy VII Remake, I'm not even sure if Dirge of Cerberus is even canon anymore. Or maybe it is because of some silly ghosts or multiverse nonsense. But this isn't a video on Dirge of Cerberus, so I'll just say, I think at the time, it was smart to let somebody else handle actually developing the gameplay of the third birthday, because I did not want Aya Brea in Requiem of Manticore. The funniest thing about it is that Kitase is by all accounts a big fan of shooters, especially first-person ones, but I suppose Dirge just burned them out, so they opted for someone else. That someone else was Hexadrive. Besides sounding like a sickness for robots, Hexadrive was a studio formed by former Capcom devs. So this is the second time that someone was scooped up to work on a Parasite Eve game. The vast majority of Hexadrive were actually programmers who did the HD version of Res, and they quickly got to work on the third birthday. And this once more seemed to be a good sign. A good deal of them had worked on the Lost Planet game, which talk about another dead franchise. I played a bit of Lost Planet for the first time for this look back, and it's pretty okay. It has the same issues of games from that era in that it plays kinda janky. The visuals can also be quite bad, but I did like the overall sci-fi concept of humans fighting a large, overwhelming threat in an environment that was completely hostile to them, which is basically the third birthday. And I didn't really have any major issues in my brief time that I tried it out. My one real irk is that all the enemy weak points seem to so far be on their butts. So yeah, if you play Lost Planet, you might get angry and start yelling at the screen, yelling at this monster to show you their freaking butthole. Crude humor aside, it was competently made, and I had no issues with the actual gameplay. A lot of times it felt like I was playing a more polished version of the third birthday. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. With Lost Planet, I can see why Square would go ahead and hire these guys for an over-the-shoulder action shooter where you fight monsters. Because I mean, they literally just did that at their last job, so it was serendipity at its finest. By all accounts, Hexadrive were good to work with, and honestly, they're the ones who kind of benefited the most from the third birthday. They've continued to get work, including HD remakes of The Wind Waker and Okami, along with the tokusatsu-inspired greatness of The Wonderful 101. If the third birthday did anything positive, it kept Hexadrive in business. And Square felt the same, as they retained them for the HD port of Type 0 and for Final Fantasy XV. And during development of the game, Hexadrive seemed to understand what was required of them, because the team was being constrained to the PSP, but wanted to push it to its limits. The team spoke on how they developed the third birthday as if it was a PS3 game, and how it was a challenge to actually make everything from the models to the backgrounds, which is honestly a bright spot of this game and is a definite plus. Graphically, it continues the legacy of the series. It throttles the PSP so hard that system is gonna have some internalized trauma years later. Some of the best cutscenes and models that the system is capable of. My only real complaint is that the main enemy is called the Twisted, who I get what they were attempting with, monsters that seem to break the law of physics and are like their namesake, Twisted. But quite a few abandoned this motif, and they seem to just be gray, lifeless, and really lacking anything memorable. It's actually insane how a game where Nomura was a creative producer seems to be lacking in creativity. That's one of his strengths. I'd argue that his creativity and his ability to craft memorable characters and enemies are the best things about him as an artist. Yes, I know the actual artist was actually Isamu Kamokokuryu, but according to interviews, at the end of the day, Nomura was kept up to date and okaying everything. Maybe he was too busy, but the Twisted are disappointing, which is a shame because they're the ones you're fighting, and the gameplay itself is also something of a highlight. If Part 2 was a massive departure from the original, the third birthday is so monumental it has its own zip code. Being an over-the-shoulder shooter, it tries its best to work within the confines of the PSP. You get a loadout of 3 weapons, but really only 2 because your pea shooter of a handgun is always taking a slot. It has infinite ammo, but it does literally 0 damage. I really wish they altered it so you either could have something else or for it to start doing more damage. You get an assortment of weapons, each with their own levels, and the more you use a weapon, the more it levels up, simple as that. Aya herself levels up, granting herself more HP to take more hits. In a neat twist towards the original, the game has anti-grinding methods, so you can't just replay the same level over and over and over to level yourself up and get overpowered. The higher your level is, the lower EXP the enemies give out, till they give you single digits, forcing you to either play on a higher difficulty or go to the next level. I actually really like this because the original game was all about, hey, there's a story here, you don't really have to grind. Well, minus that freaking tower. Anyway, back to weapons and attachments, those can be bought with BP that are awarded after each chapter. The attachments can be bought to increase a weapon stats. This seems okay, but there's like a million different guns. And the general idea is to play the game on higher difficulties to unlock better weapons, but it's a case of being overloaded. That and some weapons require a ridiculous amount of effort to unlock, like beating the game 6 or more times. Playthrough takes about 5 hours if you skip everything, so yeah. 30 hours or more for a gun is more a test of will than anything else. Unlocking some of those attachments can also test your patience. So on each mission you have a set of feats and they tell you what to do, and you can easily guess what each one means. Things like protect civilians, destroy a certain enemy, etc. The issue is that some mods are hidden behind certain feats, but the game doesn't tell you which feats give you more BP and which ones give you specific mods for specific weapons. So if you got a gun you really like, you have to just get every feat, which means more than likely replaying the same chapter more than once, because doing some feats make it so that unlocking others are more difficult. After all, unless you're a master pro, if you have an objective that says don't take any damage in this area, along with another one that says defeat all enemies quickly, how you play for most people will change up. So most will have to redo the same levels in hopes of not missing a mod for a favorite weapon. This is a shame because the actual gameplay isn't that bad. I would argue that along with its visuals, the gameplay is where the third birthday actually shines. I for the most part had fun just playing the game, removing it from its lackluster story we will dive into. It's not uncommon to hear people say that it's not a bad game, but merely a bad follow-up to Parasite Eve, and I would have to agree. When it comes to the actual meat and bones, it uses a unique gameplay mechanic called Overdive to add some fresh air to its team-based shooting. Basically, Aya can use her powers to take over another person's body. This was supposed to be unique, but Square released a flop known as Mind Jack on the PS3 a few weeks earlier, before the third birthday, that used a similar mechanic. The director, Tabata, said he actually had no idea of Mind Jack's existence, and because of its rather low ratings, that seems to be for the best. Here you use Overdive as basically extra lives. If you're about to die, just overdive into someone else. Every time you do, you retain your gear, but also a soldier's weapon, and it shows you what they're carrying, whether that's a handgun, or even larger weapons like satellite cannons. This adds a bit of strategy and tension because if those troops die, they won't instantly be replaced. Reinforcements will take time. So you can't really go guns a-blazing, and you can't restore health unless you're hiding behind cover or not in battle. So the game really stresses that while these are basically extra lives, if you're not careful, you can end up losing. Plus, if you dive out a soldier with low health, their health won't refill while fighting enemies. So it's resource management, but done rather well. While speaking of resources, each soldier has their own weapons that they can restock, but to do that you have to dive out of them. So there were a few parts of the game where things were going nuts, wave after wave of enemies, barely surviving, only for a tank to arrive and Aya diving into the controller of said tank and getting some sweet relief. There are also moments where I had to dive towards a teammate with heavy weapons, use said weapons, then dive out, taking smaller enemies apart, while the soldier with the rocket launcher reloaded. And this for the most part felt seamless. Even some cool boss battles where you're now in a chopper. When the game wants to, it does a fantastic job of getting you on edge and utilizing the overdive mechanic to its best. Your teammates are also not helpless. If you lock onto one enemy, they can do a thing called crossfire where they each converge on an enemy. This makes them weak to you so you can overdive into them. When you do that, you take massive chunks out of their life and it can net you some DNA chips. So the game encourages you to play smart and not just run and gun in most encounters. However, that being said, the game does have its issues. Firstly, being a cover-based shooter, there were a few times where one of my teammates just kinda pushed me out of cover. Not cool. Also, that whole overdiving into enemies. Yeah, sometimes when I attempted this super powerful move, the game would be like, oh, did you mean to dive into a soldier 100 feet away from you? No, I didn't intend to do that. And by the time I get back, well, missed my shot, which can be annoying. Another really bad thing is DNA chips. You use these on a DNA board to get more skills, and honestly, I have no idea how this thing works. Literally none. You would think you need to match up similar colors to boost skills, which, yeah, it does. But when you try to combine different chips, it's literally just a gamble if it would upgrade, downgrade, change the skill, or give you a malignant ability that actually weakens Aya. You can do the same motion over and over and over again and get different results literally each and every time. I get wanting to do something cool and unique. Sometimes it can work out and can make people want to see that return, like the Revelation board in Rogue Galaxy or the Sphere Grid in Final Fantasy X. The difference is those systems are fun. When I have to constantly reload to get the result I want, it makes me just want to play the game and never touch the DNA boards. And honestly, yeah, I used it once, never looked back, and beat the game. Which makes me wonder why even put it in if it's so easy to beat the game as is. Lastly, Hexadrive were limited by the PSP. So the camera here is really bad. While playing Lost Planet, it felt so much natural having the second stick to rotate and aim, but that is not the case for the third birthday. For the sake of transparency, I am playing this on a PSTV and not a PSP, but yeah, you can only move the camera with the directional buttons, and it's not great. That isn't the fault of the developers. A lot of games tended to have issues with this. Even great games like Monster Hunter had to have workarounds like the claw. Apologies to any Monster Hunter fans whose carpal tunnel I just reactivated. The game tries to solve the camera issue by making it so when you lock onto something, the camera automatically alters itself to the target, but not every weapon does this. So any big weapons like grenade launchers or sniper rifles, you have to actually reorient yourself and make sure you're looking at the enemy to aim, which just means taking hits, because some of these guys are tanky and you're gonna need those high-powered weaponry. But actually using them can be painful, or if you're trying to dodge an encounter and losing track of the enemy is a major source of frustration I felt early on. It felt like I was dying because of the game and not because of my own lack of skill. I know when I suck, which is most of the time, but not now. Limitations aside, I can see why people actually do enjoy the game. I am willing to overlook flaws like the camera on the hardware or a new developer making mistakes. What I cannot overlook is what they did to Aya. Aya. She came around the same time as other luminaries like Lara Croft, but what happens here makes me want to say, not my Aya. Now, I do like her design, the whole ripped jeans. After all, her motif was supposed to be sexy, cool, and stylish. And it was decided that the game would take place 10 years after the sequel, since it had been about 10 years in real-world time since we had last seen her. Aya was now in her mid-30s approaching 40, but because of her mitochondria, she has not aged in the least. According to Nomura, the idea was there wasn't many games or media in general that had the protagonist being an older woman, and it could lead to many interesting things. My main issue with part 2 was that they had all these threads that kinda went nowhere. So a story of Aya seeing the one she loves get ravaged by time with things like age while she stays the same? In a way, she's become the dream come true of Dr. Clamp, the villain from part 1. She's someone who is forever in her prime. She never gets sick, and because of her mitochondria, she never ages. This could lead to further feelings of alienation as she feels separate from humanity, because to an extent she isn't truly human in a scientific sense. She's something a bit beyond. But yeah, we don't get that at all. Aya looking young is just an excuse to sexualize her. Now, let's talk a bit about representation, and I know a good chunk of you just turned off the channel instantly and said, nah, screw this. I'm not gonna give you a thesis that there can be no attractive or sexualized female characters. I'm a filthy weeb, I watch anime, I love me some big ol' anime titties. Sure, I play games like Parasite Eve, but I also play games like Soul Calibur, Dead or Alive, and Bayonetta, because all those games are fun. But I'm not gonna pretend the character design isn't to appeal to men. Bayonetta is, after all, cool and stylish personified. With that being said, I don't want every game to be pure weeb bait. I love Silent Hill 3, not only for its story, but also because I felt like Heather was a great character. She felt real, she looked and acted like girls I went to high school with. Her skin wasn't perfect, she had blemishes, she didn't have a chest that made my back hurt by just looking at it, and she wasn't contorting herself into odd poses. She was a perfect fit for the game she was in. I like the fact that I can play games that are pure fan service and other games that are not. Yeah, it can be argued we don't have enough games that are pure fan service for anyone that isn't a straight dude. And hey, I'm all for evening the odds. Let's throw in some thick men with 2 C's, that's very important, who when they get defeated they moan out like they just reached their peak, because why not? That aside, I feel like what happens with Aya comes from a misunderstanding of her character. See, one of the things that happens in this game is that every time Aya takes too much damage, her clothing gets removed. And at worst, she's practically naked. You can see her ass cheek. This was not needed, and oddly enough, this was one of the first things that was created in the development of the game. Nomura said how he wanted to conflict the player, see if their Gooner side will overtake common sense. He didn't say Gooner, but he implied it with this game. You can make Aya be more naked, but it makes the game more challenging, because at certain save spots you can repair your armor for a small cost. There's also a shower scene, and you have to actually earn it to unlock it. Certain feats will allow Aya to take a shower, and yeah, unlike part 2 where I was like, she's just taking a shower, here with how arrow focused the team was on Aya, it really just feels like they wanted to see her naked. Again, me and many fans contend this was not needed, and while researching it, I think the reason this came up is because the designers misunderstood Aya. In various interviews, what kept being brought up was, yeah, they were doing this because Aya is sexy, that's a part of her character. Many on the team noted that her being sexy is a core component of her character. Yeah, she's sexy, but she's also cool and stylish. They all forgot about the other 2 parts. That when Aya was created, the idea was to make someone who was all 3. The Aya here is seriously lacking in the last 2 departments. Aya was reduced to a third of what made her. Yes, Nomura was the artist for the first game, but everyone else associated with this wasn't on that project. Tokita, the original director, was still at Square, but wasn't associated with the project. And Sakaguchi, or the Gooch as his friends call him, had left Square at that point. Everyone who was working on the game had no experience with the series, and it had been over a decade since Nomura had worked on this series. So once more, Aya was made under Sakaguchi's supervision. He deserves as much credit as Nomura, but without Sakaguchi there to correct him, and Nomura busy working himself on all the spin-offs that connect Kingdom Hearts 2 to 3, seriously, what is a 2.8? There was no time for him to be like, is this wrong? So I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, that it wasn't intentional, it was just a series of oversights. But even so, Aya's characterization was criticized for good reasons. Almost all the costumes you unlock are pure fetish bait. And worst off, Aya doesn't act her age. It's incredibly infuriating to see her talked down to. At this point, Aya had saved the world twice. She has quite literally boxed with a god. But this one dude who's your boss just dismisses her power, and I'm here thinking, you know, I punched a mutated T-Rex in the face, right? I'm the only reason you're alive twice over. But no, this douche gets to belittle her and Aya just takes it. The same Aya that in both games was shown to take initiative and even be defiant if she thought the orders she was following were wrong. Now she's just like, oh, okay. The game tries to explain why Aya is this way, because it counters the whole older woman narrative the team were going for. Basically, Aya has amnesia, so she doesn't act like the Aya fans know and love. She's weak and submissive, which brings the point if they were gonna make Aya not herself and give her amnesia, why even bother making this a Parasite Eve game? There's also another reason Aya is the way she is, and we will get to that in a bit, but yeah, it's not great. There's another returning character in Maeda, the scientist from the first one, and if you thought only Aya would be butchered, oh boy. So Maeda is also really bad, and it sucks. In the original, he was a scientist who, while having a small crush on Aya, never came off as a creep and was generally dedicated to helping Aya out. Here, yeah, no, suddenly he starts talking like he's never seen a woman before, saying things like, "Oh, Aya, your DNA, there's a younger version of you with your DNA, But yeah, I hated that they turned someone who at best had an innocent crush to a literal mouth breather who salivates over the idea of a younger version of Aya that has her DNA. When the team was asked, hey, how did Maeda know that Aya was in trouble since he was on the other side of the globe? The reason given was that his Aya sense went off, which to me seems like he was just, stalking her on her socials rather than keeping up with her. The rest of the characters play no major part besides a few story crucial ones that we'll discuss as I try to decipher this mess of a story. I'll just say it's a giant mess. But most of the new characters only get a few lines of dialogue and are ultimately forgettable. More so than the ones in even part 2. Which I started writing this a week since I played the game, and yeah, I really only remember Aya, Hydebore for really bad reasons, which we'll get into, Maeda, again for bad reasons, and Kyle Madigan, who also returns. On a bright note, the acting is actually superb, with Jensen Ackles of Supernatural fame playing the part of Kyle, and doing a great job, and Yvonne Strahovski, who had great success as Miranda Lawson, along with various TV shows and continues to find work to this day, also doing a pretty good job with what she was handled. Honestly, Square was really on their A game for the PSP and voice acting. Like, remember when they got Keith David to voice Chaos in Dissidia? Another high point before we go into the mess of the story is the music for the game is once again great. Even if Yoko was only part-timing, her and the other artists do a superb job. Instead of the more ambiotic tones of the sequel, this game elects for a more high-octane and pulse-pounding symphony, perfect for its fast-paced gameplay. I wanted to leave it on a high note because we're going to talk about the story, and it's something. So here's where to skip, and we'll try to decipher this mess. The story starts on Christmas Eve, a nod towards the original with its holiday motif. Aya is said to be wed to Kyle Madigan, but an incident happens, and she is later found on the steps of the church with no memory of what happened to her. A few weeks after, the Twisted appear. They are the main antagonists of the game, attacking population centers from their towers called Babels. If the tide isn't changed, they threaten to destroy all of humanity. Side note, it would have been dope to fight in other locations since your ability would allow that, but it's just localized to New York. After a training mission, we learn about Aya's ability to overdive, where a machine in this new group called CTI sends her consciousness into the past, and they hope with her ability she can use that to change the future. Honestly, not a bad plot, and if the story was better, imagine the possibilities. Going back into the first game, maybe even the book. But no, it's just a year. Why a year? Because the Twisted only appeared that long ago. After the training mission ends in failure because you meet a Reaper, who's a super powerful Twisted that's invulnerable, Why are they invulnerable? Who knows? The game never answers that. You're gonna hear that a lot. So it ends in failure, and you start the next mission where the Twisted appeared in a nightclub killing hundreds, and was the start of humanity's loss. Here, the game does a great job of easing you into overdiving, fighting this boss, and holding on until reinforcements with heavy weaponry arrive, which you use to defeat him. Along the way, Aya finds a survivor who tells her something of Eve, Time Zero, and a girl who Aya knew before she transforms into a monster that you have to fight as the boss. After the mission, time has changed, and you can actually review it on the computer to see how the timeline has diverged. Here, you see things have progressed and gone rather well. However, doing that one event and saving others, the butterfly effect happens. No, not the Ashton Kutcher movie from the 2000s that has a pretty decent alternate ending, but the idea that small actions can have large unforeseen consequences. From this successful mission, your douche of a boss is now alive. He was dead in the previous timeline, because now FBI headquarters was never attacked. And one of your teammates is now dead. I do wish the game explained more of what specific actions led to these outcomes. The game tries to explain with what's left, but you kinda have to figure it out yourself. And what does remain, it's not great. For instance, in one timeline, your partner Cray had to actually look it up online, forgot that much. His family was killed a few years ago, but somehow Aya changing the past changed something even further in the past. Does any of this make sense? No. Does the game explain it? Of course not. So now it's time to save Cray, but not before your boss calls you a piece of garbage and tries to kill you. He even doubts the validity of your power, which brings a good question. How would CTI prove what they were doing changed anything? Because if they succeeded, there's no record of past diving since the future they came from has been altered. But of course, none of that is answered. So you go back to the past and get assisted by Gabrielle. Because of Aya's efforts, Gabrielle, who died, is now alive. And she assists you, but don't get too used to her because she goes back to being dead. So your boss decides to betray everyone. Are we given any clear answer as to why he does this? No, of course not. I guess he just really hates Aya. So he uses a sleeping gas to knock out the entire crew and lead Aya to the park where Gabrielle in that timeline turns into a giant monster that Aya has to fight. Meanwhile, in the present, the non-monster Gabrielle is attacking your snake of a boss, which leads to more problems that my brain cannot function. Why is Gabrielle a monster in the past but normal in the present? Also, it seemed that your boss was aware of this happening, so he led Aya there to get killed. How did he know about this? Is he working for the Twisted? If so, why did he die in one timeline and not the other? If he knows that time can be altered, why is it that no one else knows and can prove it? If you're wondering if any of this is answered, no. So Aya defeats the past Gabrielle. Meanwhile, present Gabrielle attempts to stop your boss, but he remarks, "A pity you no longer exist. Since she died in the past, she no longer exists in the present." Aya then sees Eve and Kyle Madigan. After talking for a bit, they disappear. Aya laments that she can't save anyone, as it seems every time she saves one person, another takes their place. Cray is saved, but Gabrielle is dead. But now Aya has a clue and has asked her team to research Kyle Madigan as her memories are slowly returning. The next mission is decided to get the big orb, which is supposedly the heart of the Babel which the Twisted come from, and destroy it. Going into the past, your team informs you that there's no information on Kyle or Eve. Eventually making it to the big orb, you see Cray there and also see Eve, where one of your teammates say that Aya is simply seeing the possibility of Eve, whatever that means. And Cray is also seeing his daughter, who is dead. Again, Aya somehow altering things changed them in the past before she even overdived. So her doing things in 2012 affected events pre-2012. Okay? Also, this is like the third partner Aya has gotten through 3 games. Like, damn, you brought back Maeda but not Ben? Anyway, Cray said he killed everyone to try to get his daughter back, and he also turned into a monster that you must fight. While Cray in the present is once more just a normal person. After you defeat Cray in the past, team member whose name I forgot goes to the roof to confront Cray, and then he's like, why am I here? Since Cray died in the past, his present no longer exists. Aya sees Kyle once more, she begs him to go and help Eve, and Kyle goes and murders everyone at CTE minus Hyde Boar who went missing. Why did Kyle do this? I have no idea. Does the game answer it? Take a guess. So we fast forward a few months later and we see Maeda, and we learn that the human-like Twisted we fight are called High Ones, a different form of the Twisted who are more intelligent, who see both the Twisted and humanity as their enemies and disguise themselves as humans. Humanity is once more on the back foot. All this time, every time you completed a successful mission, it seemed that the timeline altered in a good way. But this time, it went worse. Possibly the worst timeline, which I don't hate. Again, with the butterfly effect, the concept, not the movie series, I do like having to find the perfect way to get a good future. It reminds me of Tokyo Revengers, where one loop actually led to the worst possible future. Maeda says they have one chance. The army tried one last attempt to stop the Babel, that Aya has to go ahead and overdive to that mission to stop the Babels and to stop Kyle. This mission, honestly, best part of the game, starts off hot and heavy. You're using tanks, you're even doing a boss fight in a helicopter. Honestly, I can see why people like the game for the gameplay. But at this point, the story is becoming insane in a bad way. Maeda's even given his own theory into the Twisted, in that they came from the future and that they decimated everything, so if nothing left, they came into the past. He's literally just making it up as he goes, which is this game. Going to the top, you find Kyle once more and he transforms into a Twisted to fight. Some sense of himself remains as he actually begs Aya to go ahead and shoot him. When she does, he says that he found it and that eternity is inside of Aya. Whatever that means. Once defeated, another flashback, this time at a church where we see Aya shoot Eve. As Aya questions, did she murder Eve? After the destruction of the High One, all the Babels merge into a Grand Babel, and Maeda says the Grand Babel is actually a giant overdive device. Wait, what? Yeah, at this point I was having no idea what was going on. Technobabble was being thrown at me faster than Usain Bolt on meth. The final mission, sorta, you ascend the Grand Babel. Once more, the game does a good job of ramping up the tension. In some parts of the last 2 chapters, they tell you, hey, there are no reinforcements, so don't screw this up. You finally defeat the Reaper, who is an annoying, invincible enemy who can typically one-shot you with a laser gun. That sucks. Seriously, it does no damage for its weakness. Luckily, you can just kind of pause the game when it hits, and then just glitch your way to victory. You then meet Hyde, who's a High One, and I seriously cannot make heads or tails of this. He says they need to go back to time 0. Hyde, or rather the High One possessing Hyde, says, we are at war with the Twisted, and every time one of us dies, the time-space power structure is consequently redesigned and the Babel grows stronger. And that the species is the foundation of the Babels, and were created as a result of Aya shooting Eve, and that Aya is their mother. Aya says she can resolve this by diving into the past, but the High One can also dive, so you both dive. Your teammates use their lives, I guess, to help you defeat Hyde, and you see the truth of what happened, and it's incredibly stupid. In a bad way, not in a good 3, 5, 8 days over 2 way. As Aya and Kyle were about to get married, some random bad guys appear and shoot her and Kyle. Who are these guys? The game never explains that. How did this kill Aya, who was once more a mitochondrial super cop who once punched a T-Rex in the face and can use her mitochondria to heal wounds. The game never answers that. And here comes the big twist that I will try and do my best to elucidate. So when Aya was shot by this group that is never mentioned again, what happened is that in a desperate bid to save her, Eve actually manifested the overdive ability and overdived into Aya. This caused Aya's soul to shatter and spread throughout time, and that's what created the Twisted. This also caused Eve's original body, because her consciousness was no longer there, to deteriorate. And this somehow created the High Ones. And that somehow made it so that they were sent into the future to go into the past and war with everyone, I guess. And the people that were at the wedding were the CTI members and Kyle, who turned into High Ones. And now they're all stuck in a time loop, I guess. Yeah, the real High Ones were the people making this game. And this reveal just makes everything so much worse. So Aya, the person everyone loves, is actually dead. And you're playing as Eve, whose age is ambiguous. But let's be honest, look at this. Look at this model and tell me that is anything but a child. So in the second game, while Eve is around 10 years of age biologically, she was only recently created, being a clone of Aya, so she's actually around 1, 2, maybe even 3 if you're stretching it. And she rightfully acts like a child close to that age. In the years from that game to this, Eve's age can be anywhere to 16 to at worst 13 years of age. Please, 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 if you're thinking about it, do not start typing age of consent laws. Please, please do not do that. Please do not write, well, did you know in some areas of the world it's perfectly legal? You don't have to finish that comment. Cause again, look, this looks like a child, and through the game she clearly acts like a child. It's a child in a woman's body. She gets emotional and she's easily overwhelmed. That makes the whole getting naked as a mechanic so much grosser. It negates the whole, we want to focus on a story of an older woman because there aren't many stories about older women. It makes all the unlocks are pure fetish bait like maids to basically being naked to what is again a child in a woman's body. And it gets even worse. To unlock everything, you gotta unlock the movie viewer, which means beating the game around 50 times, which is insane. You then have to watch the shower scene 10 times to unlock the ass cam. No, I did not unlock this. I felt like if I did, Chris Hansen would be telling me to take a seat. It does bear the question though, why the heck is any of this happening? Nomura for some reason okayed literally all of this. Aya's sexualization was already an issue, and that's before the game is like, technically you're playing as a child in a woman's body. Hyde doesn't make this better because he decides to out-creep Maeda. He suddenly starts talking like a blue checkmark, talking about how he wants her to be inside him to birth a new species that will destroy their enemies. And if she says no, he will merely fuse with her against her will and be inside her? Jesus Christ. Hyde is defeated, and look, Aya is actually alive. But not really. Aya's like, Eve, you have to kill me to set things right. Only by murdering me will things go right. This is why fans hate this game. So Eve does so, jumping into Aya's body and then killing Aya. And time is corrected somehow. Kyle notices that Aya is Eve and says he will go and find Eternity, aka Aya, and the game ends. Yeah, the game literally slaps in the face saying, oh yeah, Aya, she's actually dead. Lol. As the credits roll, we're left with nothing but questions. Again, this game has a lot of things that make zero sense, but I can't really make heads or tails of it. I left a good deal out because adding it would just make it more confusing. But yeah, why do the Twisted attack normal people if they're parts of Aya's soul? Why are the High Ones the same? Why are they at war with each other? Why did they get transported to the future to dive into the past? If the twisted come from Babbles, which are made from high ones, why would they summon Babbles if it means more twisted come if they're warring with each other? Why is it that it's not the actions that Eve takes that cause a new timeline to be created, but rather destroying a high one creates a new timeline itself? Why is it that when Eve beats a high one, her memory gets restored? If everyone at the wedding who worked at CTI became a high one, then why did Kyle, a fellow high one, kill them? Or why did they set themselves up to die at Eve's hand? The game showed that for most of the story, many of the characters seemed unaware that they were high ones. So why did no one mention to Eve what happened? Even if none of them were aware of this overdive nonsense, why did none of them mention, "Hey Aya, we're your friends"? Who or what was that military group that went and killed Aya and Kyle? What was their goal? Why is there no record of them? Why did they leave everyone else alive at the wedding? Why did no one at the wedding, including Cray, who was apparently a special ops soldier, not start firing back? How is it they attacked a church in New York City and they were able to slip away? Why is it at the end of the game, when Eve is in Aya's body, that Kyle's wound just disappeared and the group had left? If time was rewound before that, why didn't the group re-enter? I'm literally lost. My last question I want to know is, who is Tabata and Nomura's dealer? Because apparently they get the best stuff. If you beat the game a second time, you get a bonus ending where a blonde woman wishes Eve a happy 4th birthday and the game ends. Is it Aya? Is it a hallucination? Who the heck knows? Who cares? The game has a disappointing end. So that was the 3rd birthday. Needless to say, I am conflicted. Before we get into final thoughts, beating the game, you'll unlock some cheat codes. Well, really only 2 to 3 cheat codes. Every other code is literally just modifiers to make the game more difficult. And again, to unlock one of the only useful codes, you have to go ahead and beat the game like 10 times. It seems the plan was to have people keep replaying the game, but I don't know many games where that's possible without getting bored. And I say that as someone who loves a grindy RPG. Even if you beat this one in around 5 hours with skipping cutscenes, which you should, because the story is one of the worst things Square has ever put out. The gameplay is fun, I enjoyed playing it, I like the overdive system, but once more, the story is gibberish in the worst ways. Heck, I read the Q&A where Tabata tried explaining more of it, and I somehow came out even more confused. And seeing that he then made Final Fantasy XV, the game that was bare bones on launch, and I had to read a book to get the full story, maybe crafting narratives aren't his strongest suit? Just saying. Also, what they did to Aya was just unforgivable. A real slap in the face to fans. This was supposed to be her return, but instead they discarded her. I have to agree with the consensus. The gameplay is fun, and if it wasn't a Parasite Eve game, I'd give it a 3, nonsensical story and all. But for it to be a Parasite Eve game, it resembles nothing about what I love about the series, and as a fan, I have to give this game a 1. I'm not kidding. It's that bad if you view it as an extension of the series. I will give it some credit. It's very popular on YouTube, other sites to say, this game killed Parasite Eve. But no, Parasite Eve was already dead for a full decade, calm down. And no matter how many times it was brought up, Square had zero interest in doing anything with it. If the 3rd birthday was never released, it would be like Musashi, dead of Square's own will. It only came out because Nomura wanted it, and even then he was so busy, he didn't seem to notice or care they were doing a disservice to a beloved character. So if you're looking for a pretty fun shooting RPG that you can put a few hours in and you don't really care about the series as a whole, I can recommend it. If you're a fan of Parasite Eve, it's best to avoid it. Tabata himself said there's really no fan demand for the game to return, the third birthday that is. I think the third birthday should still be available. Even bad art deserves to be remembered, especially because Tabata himself remarked that if anything, he would remake the third birthday rather than remaster it. Yeah, the third birthday, the good edition. So similar to Parasite Eve 2, where I thought I was going to hate it, in the case of 2, I ended up actually enjoying it, and I felt like it was merely a game that needed to fine-tune a few elements. For third birthday, yeah, no, I do hate it as a Parasite Eve fan. It's an ignoble end to a game that was once a herald of Square's golden era, and since then there's been no peep of Parasite Eve, besides Aya appearing in gacha games. The initial plan was for this game to sell somewhere around 500,000 units and continue the series. And in its first week in Japan, it reached about 140,000 units, but ended up really only selling less than half of that 500,000 goal. I think it was a combination of word of mouth killing it, or also that the PSP was near the end of its lifespan. So the third birthday didn't kill Parasite Eve, it was just its last desperate breath before the plug was pulled. But who knows, maybe Parasite Eve will go and get an HD glow up. That's really the best we can hope for. I'm not sure that I want a remake after the third birthday. I just don't feel confident in Square handling this property. They were fine with it being dormant, and when it was brought back, it only pissed off the fanbase. Kind of a bummer the series has to end like this, but not everyone gets a happy ending, I suppose. For me, Parasite Eve ended with 2, and Aya got her fairy tale ending with her new family, with Eve and Kyle. And maybe it's best to leave it at that. And some stories are just better off untold. Well guys, gals, and those in between, glad everyone really liked the video. This journey from the start of one of my favorite games to a rather lackluster end was, well, something. Want to say love all the comments y'all leave. For the next video series, just like the story, I literally have no idea. Do I finally pull the trigger on Killer 7 and go down Suda51's catalog? Do I get around to making that dot hack video? Which I'm part 2 of the series, so that's gonna be a bit. Play another terrible RPG? Do another shorter video in between? I'm probably gonna have to do a video on the Silent Hill 2 remake, which I hope to God it's decent. We'll see. Honestly, if there's a game you want me to do a deep dive in, don't be afraid to leave a comment and I'll see if it's something that I can give the time for it. But by the time this video is released, I probably got the next one in the works, so it would be for the one after if anything else. Anyway guys, gals, and those in between, it's been a real blast. If you liked the video, like and share with your friends, and if you hated the video, send it to your enemies. Till next time, stay blessed.